paint is very nice. This is very high quality paint, really generously donated by a local paint maker. These are, she calls these her travel packs. So she normally sells them in larger proportions, but these are travel friendly. So you can, go out to a pond and paint al fresco if you want. So these are very nice, high quality. So the very first thing we are going to do is we are going to mix some paints. And the way that works is that we are going to be transferring paint from our paper palette to our plastic palette. I'll just call them that. You can think of these watercolors as concentrated. So it's sort of like if you had a powdery package of Kool-Aid and then you had a gallon of water and you dumped it in, that color would explode out and it would be so much more than it looked like it was before. So you can do, this seems like a really small amount of paints, especially if you're used to paints like acrylic or like finger paints where you would go through them rapidly. This is enough to do many, many paintings. Like that palette that I showed you earlier is 20 years old and I'm still using it. So they last a long time. And the way that you work with them is that here they are dry, you can touch them and they don't really come off on your hand. But then if you get your paintbrush wet and you touch it to one of the colors, you can see, and actually it's kind of a neat aspect of this paper palette that as you are doing it, you could go outside the lines a little bit and it starts to paint the paper around it. You can see better what the color is. So let's just go with this spring green color. And I have wet it and I'm just kind of brushing it and getting some on my paintbrush. And then I'm going to go over to my palette. You will probably want to keep yours side by side. I'm going to do this just so you can see it a little bit better. So I've got some green paint on my paintbrush, on my very tiny paintbrush. If you had a larger paintbrush, you might want to do this with a larger paintbrush just so it moves a little quicker, but I wanted to use the same one that you are. So I'm putting what's on my brush into one of the cups. And you can see how it's much paler and brighter than it was on the paper. So the paper is the darkest, the most concentrated that color can ever be. That if you used it absolutely pure with no water, that's what the color looks like. But on the paper, this is the absolute most concentrated, darkest, most intense version of this paint. Then when you add water to it, it gets lighter and brighter. So I have put a little tiny bit of this spring green color into this cup. Now I'm going to take my paintbrush, swirl it around in the water. And right now I'm not going to dry it off because I want the water. I'm transferring the water from the cup from the jar into the paint palette cup. So I'm just going to do this several times, get several drips of water in there. And you'll see that it starts to build up. And then you mix it together. And now you have a pale green. So I have, I'd say that's like maybe a sixth of the way full. It's just a little bit on the bottom. We're not going to need a whole lot right away. So now I have a paler version of this. I'm going to go back to the paint, brush it up some more, add that to the cup, and you can see it gets more intense. So I'm just going to keep adding more from the paper and then add some more water if I need to until I get just like a nice little bit that I can, like enough that you can dunk your paintbrush in and swirl it around, but you don't need a huge amount. After you get some paint, go ahead and just paint a circle. Just see what it looks like on the page.
So I did that and I thought, oh my, that's even paler than I expected. So the difference between what it looks like here and what it looks like on the page is quite a lot, actually. So I am going to make mine stronger. And by stronger, I mean I'm going to add more paint into this cup. So go ahead and mix it until you have a color that is that you can easily see on the paper. We're not going for anything in particular right now, not really pale, not really intense. I'm just going to get it so that I feel like it's a nice, like kind of average intensity. And you can see it's just a lot of back and forth, rubbing it on the paint, rubbing it in the palette. All right, this last time, that feels a little bit more representational. So you can see the first one is almost hard to see. And so is the second one, but then the third one, you can see that it's a nice crisp outline. This time I'm going to paint a bigger circle. And we're going to pretend that this is a big green grape. And the way that you think that you paint a circle is probably the way that you paint a circle. It's just basically like drawing. All right, so I have a nice consistent color throughout. I'll move it a little bit closer. And I'm going to give it a second layer. And you can see when you add a second layer that starts getting a little bit darker. You can kind of think of watercolors like tissue paper. So if you had a colored tissue paper, like a green tissue paper, and then you added another sheet of green tissue paper and another sheet of green tissue paper, it's all the same color, but it would keep building up until it was a stronger color. So I've got my light green circle. Now I'm going to dip my paintbrush into the dark green, and I'm just going to paint around the edge, just halfway. So I'm going to say that this is the bottom half of my grape. So just trace around the outside edge. And you should keep your paper flat because watercolors are runny and they'll run all over, but I can probably cheat it a little bit and show you. So you can see this is the light edge, this is the dark edge. I'm going to add a little bit more to the dark edge. And so if your paint was already wet, your light green paint was wet, when you added your dark green paint, they should be blending together. There should be like a fade of one color into the other color. We will do another example of, there's the one that we just did, but I've got all of these other shapes. It's okay if you weren't using circles before. Whatever shape you were testing before, let's add some of the dark green to that one, to one of those, just so you can see how when they're not both wet, they don't blend together. So this is me painting on top of a dry shape. You can see it is a hard line. They don't blend together. Versus this one where they were both wet and they blended together. Is this working out for people? You seeing a blend? So this is one of the most basic principles of watercolor is wet on wet and wet on dry. So if you have wet paint and wet paint, wet paint and wet paint will blend together. Dry paint and wet paint, it's just layered on top. There's no movement. So this is the way, the wet on wet is how you get subtle color variations and transitions. And then wet on dry is how you get sharp detail.